She wasn't supposed to be there. Just the maid's quiet daughter, standing in the corner while the mansion's glittering guests laughed and dined. But then the billionaire, with a smug smile, waved her toward the grand piano, expecting nothing more than a clumsy tune for his amusement. What happened when her fingers touched the keys stopped the room cold. It wasn't just music. It was a truth no one in that room was ready to face. And in that moment, everything changed. Amara had grown up in the quiet shadows of wealth, not her own, but the kind she dusted, polished, and served. Her mother worked as a maid for the Prestons, one of the richest families in the city. While the mansion's children had tutors and music lessons, Amara learned to keep silent, slipping between rooms with her school books and hand-me-down clothes. Music was her secret, played on an old, chipped keyboard her mother rescued from the trash. Each night, when the world was asleep, she let her fingers speak the words she could never say aloud. Then came the evening of the Prestons' charity gala. The air buzzed with champagne laughter and clinking glasses. Amara was only there to help, unseen, unnoticed. But one casual remark from the billionaire would pull her out of the shadows and into a spotlight she never asked for. The Prestons' ballroom glittered that night, chandeliers scattering gold light over a sea of gowns and tuxedos. Guests mingled in soft murmurs and polite laughter, while Amara stood at the far edge of the room, refilling glasses, her head slightly bowed. She wasn't supposed to be part of the event, only a shadow moving between tables. But then Mr. Preston noticed her. "Your daughter plays piano, doesn't she?" he said to her mother, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. It was more of a statement than a question. Amara's mother froze, unsure how to respond. Mr. Preston smiled thinly and gestured toward the gleaming grand piano in the center of the room. "Go ahead, play something. For fun." The words carried weight, not an invitation, but a test. Eyes turned. Conversation stopped. Amara's heart pounded against her ribs as she walked toward the piano. She knew this wasn't about music. She had felt it before, the curiosity of those who saw her not as a girl with a talent, but as a maid's daughter out of place in a world that didn't belong to her. Her fingers hovered above the keys. The first note trembled, but then something shifted. Muscle memory took over. The melody grew, swelling into the kind of music that filled more than just a room. It filled hearts. Gasps echoed in the air. Some guests leaned closer, astonished. Others exchanged glances, as if trying to reconcile what they were seeing with who they believed she was. When she finished, the silence was heavy, almost uncomfortable. Then came the applause, polite, restrained, but tinged with something unspoken. Mr. Preston clapped once, slowly, with a faint smirk that wasn't admiration, but possession. "You've got a trick there," he said, as though she were a performer he owned. From that moment, things began to shift. Guests began approaching her mother with offers. Music schools, recitals, opportunities that sounded like kindness but dripped with condescension. Amara overheard whispers about natural talent and raw instinct, as though her skill came not from years of practice but from some primitive novelty. Then came the most cutting moment of the night. One guest, a woman in diamonds, bent down to Amara and said with syrupy sweetness, "You're very lucky, dear. Girls like you don't usually get to sit at pianos like this." It stung, more than she expected, because in that single sentence was the truth of how they saw her, not as a musician, but as an exception, an outsider granted a fleeting moment in their world, a novelty they could applaud and then forget. By the time the gala ended, Amara's chest was heavy. She had played her heart out, but it felt less like a performance and more like a spectacle. And as she gathered empty glasses and slipped into the kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling that the night wasn't over, that something bigger was coming. And she was right, because the very next morning, Mr. Preston made a phone call that would change everything, forever. The auditorium was full, velvet seats lined with donors, critics, and society's elite. Tonight was supposed to be her moment. Amara sat at the grand piano center stage, the spotlight burning hot on her skin. She could barely see the crowd through the haze of stage lights, but she could feel their gaze, expectant, dissecting, waiting. She had earned this. Every note she was about to play was carved from years of practice, stolen hours after cleaning jobs, late nights when her fingers ached and her eyes burned. But before she could place her hands on the keys, a voice cut through the murmurs. "Hold on!" A man's voice boomed from the front row. It was Mr. Preston. He stood, smiling in a way that made her stomach tighten. "Ladies and gentlemen, before this young lady begins, I think you should all know. She's the daughter of my maid." Laughter. Quiet at first, then rippling through the crowd. It wasn't the warm kind. It was the kind that stripped the air from her lungs. Her fingers trembled above the keys. She could feel her pulse in her ears. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the polished wood of the piano. Instead, she stared at the ivory keys, blinking back the burn in her eyes. "Go on," Preston said, his voice dripping with mock encouragement. "Show them your gift. The room tilted. Applause broke out again, not for her music, but for the spectacle she had become. And in that moment, Amara understood. No matter how perfectly she played, they wouldn't hear her. They'd hear their version of her. An exception to their rule, a charity case to clap for before returning to their wine. Her throat tightened. The melody she had practiced 1,000 times suddenly felt like a betrayal, a performance for people who didn't see her humanity. She wanted to slam the lid of the piano shut, to walk off stage. But her body wouldn't move. Somewhere in the darkness, she heard a voice, her mother's, from the wings. Play for yourself. Amara! The first note rang out, clear, defiant. But as the music swelled, she saw them leaning in, not to feel the beauty of her song, but to marvel at how someone like her could produce it. And with each note, something inside her shifted. The applause she had once dreamed of no longer mattered. She realized with painful clarity that after tonight, she could never play for them again. The final note hung in the air like a question no one wanted to answer. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then came the applause. Loud, thunderous, the kind that once would have made her heart race. But now, each clap felt hollow, like raindrops on an empty tin roof. She stood, bowed politely, and walked off stage without looking back. Behind the curtains, her mother's arms wrapped around her. "You were perfect," her mother whispered. But Amara knew perfection wasn't the point anymore. That night, she packed away her sheet music and the dress she had saved for months to wear. She didn't quit music. No, she loved it too much. But she refused to play in rooms where her worth was measured against her skin. Instead, she started performing in community centers, schools, and street corners, where every face in the audience saw her as an artist, not an exception. In time, people began to listen, not just to her music, but to her story. She spoke about that night, about the sting of being reduced to a stereotype in the very moment. She had earned her place, and slowly, others began to share their own stories too. Because this wasn't just about one piano recital. It wasn't about one man's arrogance or one night's humiliation. It was about a truth too many live with, that no matter how hard you work, there are those who will still try to define you by the color of your skin. And yet there's another truth, that voices once silenced can rise, that stories once hidden can ignite change. Amara's music still carries the echo of that night. It's in the defiance of her crescendos, in the way her fingers linger on a note just long enough to make you feel it. She plays not for their approval, but for her own freedom and for everyone who has been told they don't belong. The question is, how many more Amaras will it take before we stop clapping for the spectacle and start listening to the humanity? If her story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it, speak it, play it forward. Because every voice matters, and silence only serves the ones who benefit from the noise.